Hey, in case you're wondering what this is, we had bats in here this morning. No. It represents one of two ways of doing life. You know, we're all on a ladder because our culture puts us on a ladder. Maybe from your earliest days in kindergarten and elementary school, you were sort of placed on a ladder to achieve. In our lives, there are lots of ladders like this. And it's usually constructed around the promise that if you could just make it to the top, wherever that is, that's where all the good stuff is. And if you devote your life to climbing the ladder, you'll achieve status, success, recognition, significance. You can devote your whole life to this ladder. And a lot of people do. Because this ladder is where you compete. Because when you're on a ladder, it's not enough that you win. Everybody else has to lose. And we have a lot of ladders in this part of our world. And once you get on that ladder, it's very hard to get off. You always look at people who are higher up on the ladder, which always makes you feel discontent. You seldom look down to people below you, because when you're climbing the ladder, you're always facing up. Rabbi Harold Kushner, he wrote about a very bright pre-med student. He was a very competitive person on the West Coast college. And this is what Kushner wrote. He writes, while traveling in the East, the summer before his junior year, this kid met a guru who said to the student, "Don't you see that you're poisoning your soul with this success-oriented way of life? Your ideal of happiness is to stay up all night to study exams so you can get a better grade than your best friend. That's your ideal of happiness. Your ideal of a good marriage is not to find a woman that matches your soul, but to win the girl that everybody else wants. That's not how people are supposed to live. So come and join my disciples in an atmosphere where we all share and love one another." Well, this kid was ripe for the message, so he called his parents and he told them that he was dropping out of school to live in a commune. And 6 months later, they got a letter from him that said this: "Dear Mom and Dad, I know you weren't happy about my decision, but I want to tell you how it has changed me. For the first time in my life, I'm at peace. Here, there is no competing, not trying to get ahead of anyone. This way of life is in such harmony with my inner soul that in only 6 months, I've become the number 2 disciple in the entire community. And I think by June, easily become number 1. See, ladder climbing can also affect our spiritual life. I think I can be the number 1 disciple by June. That's what the disciples of Jesus said. And in contrast to that, listen to this. And I really want you to listen, because I think you've always interpreted the text we're about to look at in a certain way. Paul writes this fabulous passage in Philippians 2:5, and it says this: comparison to the ladder. Let this mind be in you. Your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. Now, most New Testament scholars think that the words that follow are not Paul's actual words, but that they were actually, because of the rhythm of it and the poetry, that it was probably the earliest church hymn. So these are probably the oldest words we're about to read of the early church. Look at it. Who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Or we could say in another translation, did not consider equality with God to be grounds for grasping. You grasp when you climb a ladder. But made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. And then Paul says, Jesus, being in the very nature God, became a servant. Now, the NIV, New International Version, it translates this from a human standpoint, which most of us do. And the way they think about it is this: if I'm God, I don't have to serve anybody. That's the good thing about being God. Jesus became a servant in spite of the fact that he was God. That's the way that most of us have translated. I'm God, I can do what I want. I think I'll be a servant. I want to suggest something different. If you understand the context, if you understand the flow of Paul's argument, it's exactly the opposite. In other words, you could translate it like this: your attitude should be the same as Jesus Christ, who precisely because he was in the very nature God, precisely because he did not consider equality with God something to grasp for, he became a servant. In other words, Jesus came as a servant, not in spite of the fact that he was God, but because he was God. Paul says it is the nature of God to serve. Think about that. That's our God. That's fantastic. That's the good God that we serve. Let me give you another thought if you're not catching me here. I remember hearing a minister one time saying, as I was growing up, that we're not supposed to be proud because we're just human beings. But it's okay for God to be proud because he's God. He has it exactly wrong. When God came to earth, he came as the most humble person who ever lived. Jesus, when he came in the form of a servant, he was not disguising who God is. He was revealing who God is. And see, this whole passage is very different from this. It's very different from what you read in Forbes or the Wall Street Journal. It's not the story of someone climbing up a ladder. It's the story of someone who's coming down the ladder. Paul says Jesus is the very nature of God. In other words, Jesus, in his essential essence and being, is God. Now, think about this. In the worth chart of the universe, where would you rank the job title for God? Right? It's pretty high, right? Relatively high up on the chart. You can hardly get a promotion when you start there. Well, Jesus gave it up. He does not consider this something to be clung to. He does not consider it rationale for being able to get his own way all the time, ground for grasping. He gives it up. He comes down the rungs on the ladder and he becomes a servant. From God to servanthood. Think of this. Even angels in heaven are servants. But he goes lower than angels. He becomes a human being. He takes on flesh and blood. He takes on our means, our limitations. Jesus does this. In theology, we call it the doctrine of incarnation, which means God came down the ladder. But even on a human level, right? He becomes a human, but some people live as kings. Some people live as celebrities. So Jesus takes another demotion. He humbles himself, and he is born in a stable, not a palace. He is born to a penniless mother and father. He becomes a peasant. Jesus was born a peasant. But even that is not low enough, because there's lots of peasants in our world. Jesus keeps going down. He becomes, Paul says, obedient to death. In other words, his ultimate task was not some glorious achievement. It was not something people dream of. There's nothing glamorous about death. But even his demotion doesn't stop there. There's one rung lower. Philippians 2:8 says, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Now, when you hit death on a cross, you hit bottom. Among Jesus' people, the law said this: cursed is anyone who hangs on a cross, on a tree. So this stunned the world, and it still does. How can it be that one who was in the very nature God, but he humbles himself to die on a cross? You see, here's the problem. If you spend your life, your one and only life, climbing this ladder, the problem is that you will go right past Jesus, who is coming down. Serving and self-giving love turns out to be the most God-like thing a human being can do. That's kingdom life, not church life, kingdom life. There's a lot of ladders, even in church life. So Jesus starts this community to teach people what life in the kingdom is about. But they had a hard time. They had a hard time with this teaching. You know why? Because they were just like you and me. We're climbers. In fact, the disciples had arguments many times about who is higher on the ladder in terms of disciples. I'm the number one disciple. In fact, look at this, Luke chapter 22:24. And a dispute rose among them, the disciples, as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Is that coming down? Who is the greatest? You know, I grew up, born in Louisville, Kentucky. You know Muhammad Ali? You may raise your hand. I don't see all the first service people. Ali used to say this: I am the greatest. I am the greatest of all time, right? And he tells this story. One time he was on a plane, and everybody was supposed to buckle up their seatbelts. Well, Ali goes by his own deal. So a flight attendant said, "Sir, you have to put on your seatbelt." He answered, "I'm the greatest. I'm Superman. And Superman doesn't need a seatbelt." And she said, Superman also doesn't need an airplane. The disciples used to have this argument. Who is the greatest? Not only was it the disciples, it was some of the disciples' parents who came to Jesus and said, when you get into your kingdom, up there in the kingdom, can one of my sons sit on your right and the other one sit on your left? And those were places of prestige. In other words, can they be number 1 and number 2? So when Jesus heard this, he decided to paint a picture for them. The most menial job that you could have in that day was to be a foot washer, to wash somebody's feet. In those days, people mostly went around either in sandals or barefoot. Roads were dusty, and when it rained, roads were muddy. On top of that, there were animals on them all the time, a lot of animal traffic. Nobody cleaned up after their animals. So feet were not hygienic. They were considered to be foul. To wash someone's feet meant you would have to take a step down the ladder. So one night, all the disciples were getting ready for dinner, and nobody wanted to wash feet. If I do that, I might as well tell people I'm not the number 1 disciple. Maybe they were even arguing about who had to wash the feet before dinner. Listen, Jesus, being in very nature God, in other words, Jesus, because this is what God does, he takes a towel, and by the way, nobody ever makes it on GQ magazine covers picking up a towel. And Jesus takes a towel and a basin of water, precisely because he was in the very nature of God. He gets down on his knees, being in the very nature of God, takes a basin of water and towel, and he goes to Peter. Peter says in John 13:8, "No way, Lord. No way you're going to do this." And Jesus says, "Peter, this is necessary. You need to get this." And Jesus, precisely because he is God, he takes those dirty feet, unclean feet, with his hands, and he washes them, and he dries them, and he does this from one disciple to the next, to the next, to the next. These guys were climbers, just like you and me. And when he's done, this is what he says to them. John 13:12. "Do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher, Lord, and you're right, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord, your teacher, have washed your feet." And you would almost think he'd say, "Now you need to wash my feet." He doesn't say that. He says, "You should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed. You'll be better off. You'll be happy. You'll be much more content if you do them. Because this is how God rolls." Jesus started what might be called the fellowship, not of the ring, but the fellowship of the towel. It's an alternative community to a world of ladder climbers, where people would put a towel over their arm and ask, "Could I serve you? How can I help you?" How can you help others in this church, in this community? Well, we're going to be moving next week. I'm kidding. No, we're not. Well, I am moving next week. But in this community, where there is not to be climbing, no comparing, no competition, we're supposed to be a community of foot washers. And it may be that the hardest thing in the world is to turn ladder climbers into towel bearers. But that's how we will change this world, this community. It's really a strange thing, but towel bearing ends up, and I know you're not going to think of this because it doesn't sound like it's right, but Jesus said it is right. Towel bearing ends up bringing more joy than ladder climbing ever will. Jesus, as an example, who went down the ladder to the lowest rung, was what? In our text, Philippians, he was exalted by God to the highest place. The day is coming, Paul says, when everybody is coming off this ladder and every knee will come down and touch the ground and every tongue will confess. Can you imagine what that would be like? Donald Trump, he comes down the ladder and his knee is going to touch the ground. Beyonce, her knee is going to touch the ground. Big Bird, that big goofy bird, knee is going to touch the ground. Kim Jong-un, his knee will touch the ground. Vladimir Putin, his knee will touch the ground. Every knee will bow. And every tongue is going to confess the one who humbled himself to the lowest place and has now been exalted and given the highest name. And by the way, it's not just Jesus who finds that serving is the path to joy. Jesus said this to his friends, John 13:17, now that you know these things, you've heard it, and now you've seen it, you are blessed, you're fortunate, you're happy, you're lucky if you do the same things. Oh, I was thinking about this, just a case in point in our lifetime. Why was Mother Teresa, who was just in this obscure village in India, what made her such a star? It was her servanthood. Her servanthood. There was no part of her that was trying to climb the ladder of success. What does God want to do through VVC? I'll tell you one thing. I think he wants this to be a community in this crazy part of the world, for this to be a place where ladder climbers are being transformed into towel bearers. And that's so hard. It is so hard. We all struggle with this. This week, yesterday, I was sitting in my office working on this message, putting some last things, and Laura says, Dwight, could you go to the store, pick up a couple of things that we need for the house at Lowe's? And my immediate response is, no, I can't do that. I'm writing a message on how important it is to serve. Laura, I've got to convince people to set aside their petty agendas, to get off their ladders and go out and do some servanthood. Why can't you go get it? But it's not all bad. I got a chance to serve. I did drive. There was a gun put to my head. And I also got a message illustration, which maybe doesn't make it count anymore. Here's the question. What do you want to do with your life? It's your one and only life. And when you're on your deathbed, people don't even talk, those that are very high up in corporate America, they don't think that much of the board meetings, of the accolades. They often think of regret, of their families, often neglected because they were climbing the ladder. Do you want to be about the ladder? Work, academic achievement, being athletic, physically attractive? I got off that ladder years ago. But there are all kinds of ladders. Do I want to make my life about the ladder or what's in your chair? The towel. So I want to give you a moment to just talk with God. And if you would just bow your head for just a moment and try to maybe close your eyes just to close out everybody else around you. I want you to take that towel as a reminder. And maybe you can put it on your office chair. Maybe you can just, wherever you are a lot, maybe a place in your home, maybe in your car. But keep it with you. Keep it with you for a whole year. And let it be a constant reminder. It's a scary thing to get off the ladder. I've got to climb. That's what we think. But while we're climbing, the greatest man who ever lived was coming down the ladder. So take a moment to tell God if your decision is that you want to be a towel bearer, you don't want to be a ladder climber, and if there are changes that are involved, just submit them right now. Lord, I want to change. God, with your help, I really do want to be a servant. I really do want to be a follower, a true follower of Jesus in this place, in this community. I want to be a kingdom bringer.